Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
What would your reaction be if the Canucks don't unload Brock Boeser today?
Yeah, I'm not expecting that to happen, but if the Canucks don't trade Brock Boeser, I think that would be a massive missed opportunity. It's complicated because the Canucks are perched in the standings the way they are. They're ahead of the Calgary Flames by point percentage as a result of Calgary's overtime loss last night. So, they are in a position where, they're in a playoff spot, and it's difficult to sell from a playoff spot. But let's be real. The JT Miller trade and the logic of that changes the trajectory of the Canucks from a team building perspective. And I think necessitates some difficult but obvious choices here. This club needs to look forward and not forward to the next 6 weeks and potential pair of playoff home dates, but forward beyond that to get this organization and this team back on track from the perspective of contending the way we sort of expected that they might be able to this year based off of what they did the season previous. And that requires, I think, being willing and ruthless about managing your risk, especially with players of Boeser's caliber, when they're pending UFAs and there doesn't appear to be a straightforward path to a compromise deal that would keep him in Vancouver, which, and Rick can speak to it too. All indications I've had for months, but really heating up this week, was that there was a pretty fundamental divide on what the price was going to be on Boeser's next contract. And given that, I think the internal logic of the moves that this team has made across the last month in particular, dictate that you have to be willing, I think, to rip off the Band-Aid and do what needs to be done for the long-term health of this franchise.
What are your thoughts on Brock Boeser's legacy in Vancouver?
Yeah, I think when I consider Boeser, and I consider his Canucks tenure and sort of the different sort of paths that took, some of the bad luck injuries that he dealt with early on in his career, obviously the electric rookie season that saw him be a Calder runner-up, and then the player he became, right? This reliable defensive winger, this able playmaker, a guy who was an absolute monster as a screener at the net front. A player who scored one of the most clutch hat tricks in Canucks history in Game 4 against the Nashville Predators to really, pull an iron out of the fire for a Canucks team that might have been in real trouble in that series had Boeser not come up the way he did. I'll think of the development. I'll think of the way that he adapted his game to make it all work. And the conversation around Boeser is so frequently centered on what he can't do and ignored all the different weapons he added to his game, right? The work at the net front, the down low playmaking, the way he became such a reliable matchup option for the Canucks on the wings, the chemistry he built as sort of a down low force alongside JT Miller. This is a guy who dealt with a lot of trials and tribulations in terms of his personal life. I think that, in some ways that matched what the team was going through on occasion, but obviously with Boeser, whether it was Duke, whether it was other things in his life, like this was a guy who was a consummate pro, kept working on his game, right? Represented this franchise as well as you could ever ask, no matter what was going on with him personally, or no matter how frustrating, the results on the ice were for him personally or for this team. And I think that's going to be sort of the legacy, one of the most likable Canucks players, frankly, of the last 15 to 20 years. And a player who, when the stage was biggest, right, when the lights were brightest, was at his best in Canucks blue.
Hey, Thomas, look ahead. If Boeser gets moved, what is it telling the team? Like, what's the message that, okay, we're still going to make the playoffs because we're taking out a top six winger here? What's the message if he gets moved?
Well, it's got to be opportunity, right? It's got to be, hey, look, this is opportunity, right? This team can't afford to wave the white flag. And one thing that I won't be shocked by, Rick, because we've talked about it all week, if Boeser gets sold, right, I'm not expecting the Canucks to necessarily sit with those assets indefinitely. If they get draft picks, are they going to make it to the draft with those draft picks? Probably not. That's not their MO, and that's not what they want to do. They want to add and pivot and sort of bring in additional young talent into this organization, ideally center depth. So I think we'll have to see the full picture before declaring exactly what the message is. But I think the reality is it's a business. That's part of the message. And then the story Rick Tockett's got to be driving home is like, hey, look, we've got Jonathan Lekkerimäki. He's going to get a big opportunity here. Drew O'Connor has been a find for us since he was added to this lineup. He's, playing top six all season now. And we've got Kiefer Sherwood, and we know what Kiefer Sherwood can do as a goal scorer, right? We know what he can do as an X factor for this team. We saw it repeatedly in the first 3 months of the campaign. We're going to need more of that now that he's playing top nine. And so, you've got Höglander too, who can always bump over to the right side. It's really about challenging those gentlemen to step up, and just sort of, trust that this group can hold it together. Things haven't gone their way, and yet this team has been able to hang around the playoff picture. We got to do it again in the wake of selling, Boeser and potentially other pieces too ahead of the deadline. That's got to be the message. And look, it's the only responsible path that this organization could have charted today. So, we'll see exactly how it all turns out, but I think that's got to be the message. You guys are pros. This is what it looks like. We can still make the playoffs if we all play to our capability.
Thomas, coaches are really involved at trade deadline week because the manager, communicates with the coach. We got a coach here that's not signed for next year. What's going on with Tocchet? He's not here. They must be asking him, who do you want to stay? Who do we get rid of?
Yeah, I'm sure it's been a frustrating season. I think we all know that. We can tell from the body language. I think we also should. I know he's come under a lot of fire locally for this team's lack of goal scoring production, but I think if this team wasn't impeccably well organized, they would have been long gone in the playoff race before now. Given all of the stuff that this team has dealt with, given the underperformance of Elias Pettersson, prolonged injury absences to Quinn Hughes and Filip Hronek, both members of their top pair. Thatcher Demko has started less than 20 games this season. If I told you all of that before the season, you would have thought this went an awful lot worse than it has. And I think it's a credit to Tocchet that it's gone as well as it has. So this guy should be a priority to retain. I think he's brought a mentality. I think there's clear alignment with hockey operations in terms of, problem solving, talent evaluation, sort of deployment, how that all sort of dovetails and works together to, at least certainly last season, we saw it where this team was able to punch well above their weight as a result of their, ability, as it were, to sort of work together and solve hockey problems as sort of this brain trust. So you hope that they'll get a chance to continue working on that. But clearly, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that it's been a frustrating offseason. And, Tockett's the reigning Jack Adams winner. He was just on that Hockey Canada staff that won the Four Nations face-off. Price of the brick has probably gone up, and there's often a financial component to these sorts of talks too. So will be very interesting to watch how it plays out. And certainly is going to become, on the other side of this deadline, the biggest story around this team for the balance of the season, Rick. I think there's no question about that. But yeah, I think when you look at Tocchet, retaining him should be a priority. I think he's done, you probably wouldn't say it's been an excellent work this year, given all of the various fires that have been raging around this team. But I think his efforts have been key in sort of keeping the ship afloat, as it were, through enormously choppy waters as this year has progressed.
Okay, getting back to trades, your opinion of the Canucks' decision to send Carson Susi to the Rangers for a third-round draft pick, and what that trade says about the development of the young EPD, Elias Pettersson.
Yeah, well, I really like where the Canucks are at in terms of the state of their back end, and I think that's the first time I've ever uttered a sentence like that on your program. Donnie, I think the Canucks back end, both in terms of the Marcus Pettersson of it all, the Elias Pettersson of it all, Myers has had a great season. We know what Hronek and Hughes can do, and Tom Villander's still coming, Victor Mancini, you've got Derek Forbert. I mean, there's an amount of depth and overall top-end quality, too, that gives the Canucks a well above average back end in NHL terms. And so, I think within that sort of paradigm, I think clearing up the logjam and moving off of Carson Susi and the $3.25 million cap hit that his contract had this year, but also next season, gives the Canucks some extra flexibility and bullets to go about, solving a critical need in terms of adding scoring to this lineup, especially in the wake of an anticipated Boeser move before the deadline. So, I think when you consider all of that, when you consider those sort of wrinkles here, I think the Susi deal makes sense in isolation. I think we understand that reallocating that cap space mattered. I think we understand freeing up minutes to develop Mancini, to develop Elias Pettersson, to eventually get Tom Belander into the lineup. And yet, one thing I do want to point out is over the course of deadline week anyway, we've seen a bunch of players, for example, that the Canucks previously traded in deals in which they were considered to be negative value portions of that trade. You have Andrei Kuzmenko goes for a third to the LA Kings today. You had Vinny Desharnais traded as a negative value part of the Marcus Pettersson trade, a month and a bit ago, acquired for a 5th round pick by the San Jose Sharks. And there's an element to which you trade Susi now in the midst of a disappointing season when I think he's a pretty good player, right? And there is an opportunity cost that you incur when you do that deal now, right? Like you actually saw it with Brian Dumoulin, right? Going for a second and a prospect, a recent 3rd round prospect, like a pretty interesting one, the same day that Susi was dealt. Susi's a better player than Dumoulin. Why did Dumoulin return more in a trade? Well, he was expiring and the team retained, right? The team retained 50%. 12 months from now, Susi's value at the trade deadline would have been higher. He would have had less trade protection. You could have retained without it being a long-term liability for you. There would have been more flexibility to net more than the Canucks ultimately did for Susi. So while it makes hockey sense to have made the deal now, and I'm by no means criticizing the organization so much as just sort of pointing something out, as this team enters a transitional phase for themselves, I do think one thing that they're going to have to be more mindful of than they have been, if they're going to ultimately sort of accelerate past the other mushy middle teams and get back to contending, is aggregate value, right? Managing the value, the value within the organization, generally speaking. And I just worry with Susi, and we've seen it play out repeatedly with Desharnais and with Kuzmenko, among others. Trading guys with term remaining when you can wait and get more for them later, I think that's just like a subtle way to slowly bleed out some value. Not as important an area to manage as not allowing players like Brock Boeser to walk without returning any compensation in free agency. Don't get me wrong, but just a small thing that I sort of thought as all the news unfolded is that, yeah, I think this deal makes sense from a hockey perspective. You can see exactly what they're getting at in doing it. And yet I'm pretty confident that 12 months from now, Susi would have been worth 50 cents more on the dollar. And that is something that is part of the cost to the Canucks of doing business the way they did this week with Susi going to New York.
Thomas, we know how busy you are. We can't thank you enough for joining us on this trade deadline day, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen.